Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to what will likely be, barring an emergency, the last meeting of the CVRD and this committee for sure for 2019. I'm Ian Morrison, Chair of the Electoral Area Services Committee. I'd like to note that we're having this meeting in the territory of the Coast Salish people. I'd like to begin by acknowledging today we have with us Alternate Director Haim, Alternate Director Taylor, and Alternate Director Ryan. And we have a fairly light agenda before us today, but just, oh, that's a great reminder. And perhaps everyone could turn their electronic devices to silent. Thank you. And before we go any further, I'd like to turn to our General Manager of Land Use Services as she has a brief introduction to make. Ms. Sherolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an announcement to make regarding staffing in the Land Use Services Department. We are happy to have Frank Limshew as our new Manager of Development Services, and Frank is with us today at the staff table. I'm also pleased to announce that Ian McDonald is now our permanent full-time Manager of Building Inspection and Bylaw Enforcement.
Wow, welcome. Oh, it's on. Good. I didn't break it, but the button to activate my mic is broken. I would also take this opportunity before we dive into our published agenda for everyone to take note that, if anyone is interested, please contact Director Yanni DiNardo. There is an agricultural adaptation to climate change on Vancouver Island initiative, and there are meetings that are scheduled for early February, one in Victoria, one in Coombs, one in Merville, and Director Yanni DiNardo has the information if there's anyone interested in attending. Very important topic for everyone. And with that, I would like to go to the published agenda and ask for approval of the agenda unless there's any items to add to the agenda today. Moved by Director Yanni DiNardo, seconded by Director Acton. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item of business is adoption of the minutes of the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of December 4th, 2019.
Turn to committee. Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Alternate Director Ryan. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. Ms. Legault, any business arising?
None.
Public input period. Now's the opportunity for members of the public who would like to provide input to the committee on items on our agenda for today. Welcome.
Hello, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I would like to take a moment to thank you all for your service to your community. I think it's not an easy job for the directors or the staff, and welcome to our new staff member, and congratulations, Mr. McDonald, on your appointment. I do have a couple of concerns. And we saw it, although I wasn't here, I was watching from afar. On the last ESC, we had a senior staff report, verbal report, and then another one again today. And when we only have verbal reports, there's no information for the public to know ahead of time to maybe make comments. And there was a report last week about the harmonization, and there was a PowerPoint presentation that I don't believe was made available to the public. And these are items that are important to the public. Today it's about development variance permits, and we'll have to wait and see what Ms. Carla is going to present. But it just, there's a disconnect sometimes between the table here and the public, either watching at home or taking time from the gallery. And Mr. Chair, I did have a concern about the harmonization. You saw an application recently where the public came out very strongly against the proposed rezoning application. And if that is a test of the harmonization process, I think it failed miserably. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that'd like to provide input to committee on items on our agenda today? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Cliff Evans from Shawnigan Lake, Director of the Shawnigan Basin Society and member of the Shawnigan Research Group. On your agenda today, on R2, you have a subdivision up for you to discuss. And that subdivision just happens to be across from a contaminated well that has 15 parts too many for drinking water. And right next to it is a contaminated soil site with polyaromatic hydrocarbons and lead in it. And so this is a registered dump site out of compliance. Mr. Chair, what I wanted to make the people or this board aware of is that this aquifer could be contaminated. And so here's a subdivision going in, and it has an excellent repairing report by Aquatech. Everything looks good, but the one thing that the QEPs don't do is check the water. And so I've had a chat. I just met the person that is putting this property up for subdivision today, and he has agreed to test his water for polyaromatic hydrocarbons and lead. But in all other cases, I think that the subdivision looks good. We just can't, I think we have to be aware of the lead perhaps in the aquifer, and that lead can damage the brains of small children. There are small children in that neighborhood. So I think this is very important that this would be checked out. And everyone aware of it. The other thing is I see a building report.
You've got 20 seconds left.
I see a building report today, and it would be nice to see a soil deposit bylaw report too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to provide input to the committee on items on our agenda today? Seeing none, let's proceed. Next item is Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No delegations or correspondence, so the next item is R1, Report from Inspections and Enforcement Division on the November 2019 Building Inspection Report, and it's for information.
Mr. McDonald, are you planning on getting up, or is it just for information? Does any of our committee have any questions for Mr. McDonald, or? Seeing none, I'm really excited about my building and permit numbers for my area, but beyond that, hey, I've come in last every year, and I'm not in last place this year. R2. Ms. Legault?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is an application from the Development, or a report from the Development Services Division regarding application development permit 19B02. And there are, the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that development permit DP 19B02, PID 029813972 be issued, and that staff notify the owner of Lot A Goldstream Heights Drive that an amenity contribution of $10,000 must be made to the Shawnigan Lake Recreation Specified Area Capital Projects Reserve Fund pursuant to Electoral Area B zoning bylaw.
Mr. Munn, welcome.
Good afternoon, committee chair, members, public attendees, and staff. And I'll note that the applicant for this application is here if you have any questions. I'm here today to report on Report R2 Development Permit DP 19B02, Lot Stream Heights Drive. The purpose of the development permit is to ensure that the development permit guidelines are addressed by the applicant before subdivision of the land can occur. 4 sets of development permit guidelines apply: general, landscaping, rainwater, environmental protection, riparian, and subdivision. The subdivision and landscape plans do not address the letter of the guidelines, but do address the intent of the guidelines. And I'll just note, and the comment made earlier, that the subdivision bylaw does require that a potable water test be carried out prior to final subdivision approval. The riparian assessment indicates that the site is not highly sensitive, although it is important that the headwaters of Van Horn Creek are not contaminated by silt or erosion, a main purpose of the application. Note that the RR2 zone is also subject to an amenity contribution of $10,000, and there is a choice here, and the report recommends one of those choices. That money be forwarded to the Community Parks Capital Reserve Fund or the Shawnigan Lake Recreation Specified Area Capital Projects Reserve Fund. This image shows the proposed 2-lot subdivision, and as you can see, there are the two significant riparian areas are termed as ditches: roadside ditch and driveway ditch, which has a spia. And if you have any questions about those items, I'll be happy to answer them.
Turn to the director for the area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Munn and I spoke about this earlier, but you mentioned the amenity contribution and the option of the 2. So I'm just curious if there's a policy around or a procedure around when this happens, because in the past it seemed like it would come up to either the director or to the commission.
Ms. Churl?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the land use bylaw states that it's up to the CVRD to determine which fund is appropriate. In this case, that refers to the board, and that's why the recommendation is coming to the committee for consideration as a whole.
Director Nicholson?
Sort of along those lines, what I'm wondering about is the wildfire protection aspect of it. And it says in the report that this isn't part of a, where did I see that? It's not part of a wildfire protection area? Is that right?
Mr. Munn?
I've lost this now. It is not in a fire service area, but the fire safety thing says that it's encouraged, suggested the property petition to be included in a fire protection area. I don't understand how you get into a fire. Does the Malahat Fire Department service that area, and do you have to ask to be in it, or would they have to expand their area? And why would an amenity contribution in an area of high fire risk not also include the option of contributing to the fire department?
Mr. Munn, do you want to take that?
Okay, I'll try and take those one at a time. And first of all, the area is not within a wildfire interface development permit area, and that's because the guidelines apply only to buildings and not to subdivisions. So the guidelines don't apply. We did discuss this with the applicant prior or as they were applying, that this is a very important issue here because this is a wildfire area of extreme hazard, and it is not covered in a fire service area. The closest fire service area is Malahat, and this is a big gap in the service. So what happens is homeowners would either have a high fire insurance bill, or some may be uncovered, or not covered by a policy. And that is important when we look at the landscape of the area, which has been cut not too in the distant past, but has a lot of broom and other very flammable vegetation growing there. So recommended was a wildfire report to come along with this. What we got was a letter making some suggestions. And for example, the lot next to this, they've provided, under similar conditions, they've provided a more detailed report. But if the applicant does provide the details according to development permit guidelines prior to its building, then they will be exempt from following those guidelines if Fire Smart is applied. So that takes care of some of the issues, but public safety is now actively approaching neighbors in the Goldstream Heights area to establish a fire service area, and there will be a cost associated with that, but it provides or will provide a much better level of service for health and safety of the area. I hope that answers most of the questions.
Mr. Tippett, to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think John did a good job of explaining some of the background and the fact that public safety is working on actively trying to get a petition going for that service to expand into that area as evidence that we're thinking about that. Just to go back to the root question, which was why is the fire department not one of the potential receiving beneficiaries of the $10,000 amenity clause? The former board, when Director Fraser represented Shawnigan Lake, was of the opinion that it was better to provide the opportunity for some limited additional development there with this amenity clause being directed either to parks or to the recreation center, with the assumption being that the mere fact of the land being subdivided would generate revenue, which might then build a mandate to extend fire protection service to that area. In other words, allow people who weren't presently covered by it to have some capital that they could deploy in defraying the costs that John was talking about in establishing a service there. There's certain infrastructure that would have to be built, including water storage and so forth. So that was why it was not included at the time. It was felt that the incentives as designed in the zone's amenity clause were appropriately directed. But that was then. We'll see. We hope that fire protection does move in there fairly soon.
Follow up?
No, I just have a comment. I just find it remarkable that in this day and age, when we've got this increasing risk of wildfire, that we're allowing the development way out in the bush. We're continuing to allow the development way out there.
Turn to the director for the area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move the recommendation number 1 and number 2, although for number 2, I would like the amenity contribution to go to parkland acquisition, not Shawnigan Lake recreation capital projects.
Okay, I think that was different than what was
Yeah.
read out.
So I
So
could-
have you got that?
I could read
Is
it out.
part of the report
To the, to
as an
that.
option? I'm not at that point in the report. Hang on, let me get there. Mr. Munn?
The other option was to deny, but we could have, it's up to you to make a change to that recommendation.
I'm happy to read it out with the change.
Well, I just want to be sure that it's a qualifying recipient under the regulation. So, Mr. Munn, could you bring us some clarity on this, please?
Sure. In the report, I've quoted the zone and the amenity contribution section, which says that the amenity be provided to either of the following public amenities: the Community Parks Capital Reserve Fund, Area B, Shawnigan Lake, or Shawnigan Lake Recreation Specified Area Capital Projects Reserve Fund. And the second is what was recommended based on the finance recommendation.
So we're moving 1 and we're moving 2, but we're substituting the Area B Parks Capital as opposed to the Shawnigan Lake specified area. Is that what your intent is?
Yes.
Okay, so you're moving that. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Everyone is clear on what the motion is? Looks like it. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? I see none opposed. That motion carries. Ms. Legault, you've got the appropriate information you need for that. Thank you. Next item, Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. R3 is a verbal report from the General Manager, Land Use Services, regarding Board of Variance for information.
Ms. Terrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My verbal report is a very brief one. It's to inform the committee that we will be advertising for Board of Variance appointments early in 2020. There was a report that came forward to the committee earlier this year, and in that report, staff indicated and confirmed that the Cowichan Valley Regional District's required to have a Board of Variance, and that we would be proceeding with soliciting appointments to that committee. We simply wanted to inform you that we will now be doing that, and that we also wanted to encourage you to communicate that to your constituents and to those who might be interested in applying for those appointments. Thank you.
Director Acton.
Thank you. So my understanding is the Board of Variance has never really done, or hasn't done very much in the last while. Can you expand a little bit on how often we've used them and how
Ms.
much,
Terrell.
what the workload is expected?
If possible, I'd like to defer that to Mr. Tippett, who's been with the CBRD for more than 20
Mr.
years.
Tippett.
The old man will speak. Yes, it is correct, Director Acton. We haven't had a lot of Board of Variance applications in recent years for obvious, well, if someone had applied, we would have had to appoint one. But the last time I think we had a Board of Variance hearing might have been 2013 or 2014. It shows up in our annual report on application statistics. I think in all of the time I've been here, which is now 20 years, we've probably had maybe 8 or 9 applications, so they're very infrequent. The thing about the Board of Variance, quite apart from what the General Manager said about being mandatory, is they do enjoy certain powers that this board doesn't have, which is, for example, allowing increases to the sort of physical presence of legal nonconforming use, for example, expansion of legal nonconforming use, and also any decision they make has to be based on a determination of hardship as they deem to be in play or at play. And in some senses, it could be perceived as maybe an appeal body, like if this group gets a variance application and rejects it, then I suppose any applicant who wanted to have a second look at it could apply to the Board of Variance. However, I would say the Board of Variance, in theory, might even have a more strict interpretation of what would be justification for a variance because of the legislative requirement that they determine there's a hardship. But the bottom line is, it's a fairly infrequent type of application. Having said that, there have been a few over the years, actually at Shawnigan Lake, a few I can think of, and so I think we need to move forward with the appointments.
Just before I go to Director Yanni DiNardo, I had some follow-up. Sure, go ahead.
So I guess because it's been so infrequently used, could we not just appoint a Board of Variance when we have a need for it?
Ms. Terrell?
The short answer to that, Mr. Chair, is no. We are required to have one by legislation. We're currently not in compliance.
Final follow-up? Sure, go ahead, make a comment.
Well, I'm the reason why I'm asking these questions, and I'm hesitant towards asking the community to sit on a board that's rarely gonna get used. The community is already feeling like, at the APC level, like they're not used enough and they're not appreciated enough. So again, are we appointing people to sit on something, so they've put their hand up, they're all gung ho, and we don't actually honor their time and commitment?
Thank you for your comment. I'm just going to wade in that there's been a form of a board of variance the entire time that I've been here. It is infrequently used. It is a legislated requirement. There has been comments and initiatives by directors at this table and at other local governments across the province to initiate discussions with the province to perhaps eliminate or modify or whatever around, and I can tell you that this has gone through AVICC, it has gone through UBCM, and it has not been supported. It's been, any requests to change the legislation have been essentially flat out denied. So there is a legislated requirement to have them. We have, as Ms. Sherolf has said, we're out of compliance. And I think that they will do a good job in making the applicants that apply aware of what's of what the requirements of the job are. So I've got Director Yanni DiNardo, Director Nicholson, and alternate Director Taylor, and I will come back to Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Ms. Sherolf. Are these annual appointments, and how many people sit on them?
Ms. Sherolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Board of Variance for Regional District consists of 3 members, and they would be appointed for a period of 3 years.
Director Nicholson.
2 things. I'd like you to let us know when it's advertised so that we can distribute it to our lists. And the second thing is, if you're a member of an APC, can you be on the Board of Variance?
Ms. Sherolf.
The Local Government Act states a person is not eligible to be appointed to a Board of Variance if the person is A, a member of the local government or the Advisory Planning Commission, or B, an officer or employee of the local government.
Alternate Director Taylor.
Thank you. I guess that answers my question, because I thought maybe we could have APC members be on variance, but I guess not. Thank you.
Director Acton to close.
Are you in a hurry, Mr. Chair?
Already blew past the 20 minutes.
Well, so you say we're not compliant, but have we ever seen what would happen if we don't actually do it? Like, have we ever seen the province actually do anything about people not being not in compliance? So are we really worried about this? Because having a Board of Variance could, in my opinion, only hurt us, not help us, but.
I think we'll take that as a rhetorical question. Fair enough?
Sure.
Seeing no other hands. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item UB1 is 2020 resolutions to the Association of Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities, and this item was referred to from the last Electoral Area Services Committee meeting for direction.
So just as a prelude to this, at our last meeting, we announced that Director Yanni DiNardo or myself or Director Salmon would be prepared to have discussions around possible issues that would be appropriate to send forward to AVICC. And I've heard from no directors. I don't believe Director Salmon has. Director Yanni DiNardo, have you heard from anyone wishing to put a resolution forward?
No, I have not, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I took some time to look at resolutions that have been produced by this committee and the CVRD and put forward. There have been years in which there weren't issues that needed to be addressed at a regional or provincial level. I've got the list here if anyone's interested in looking at them. Is there anything that anyone is, Director Nicholson?
So This issue of 5G coming to a community near you has become, people in my community are raising that with me all the time. And I really don't know a lot about it, and I know it's probably more of a federal thing, but I'm wondering if there is something that we should be thinking about along those lines.
Look to staff, don't see anyone jumping into that one. It's indeed a federal issue, and I know that we've had issues go forward to AVICC, and some have not been accepted by the executive there. But any staff want to wade in on whether or not that would be an appropriate resolution to come out of electoral area committee, or? Ms. Sherolf?
Mr. Chair, I would say that if there were any potential resolution topics that are brought forward and you're not capable of formulating a resolution today, that you could refer the issue to staff and we could report back if that's your desire.
Director Nicholson?
I'd like to do that.
Okay, before we take a motion, I'll go to alternate Director Taylor.
Well, I'd like to put forward the idea that maybe we should be promoting ride sharing. We've seen the introduction of it just the other day in Tofino. I happened to be in Denver a couple of weeks ago and used it very successfully. I think it's a solution to our transportation needs, particularly in an area like Saltaire, where a limited bus route will not serve the people well. Even for low-income people with ride sharing, you can choose to have a shared ride with 2 or more, up to 3 pickups. So that reduces the cost significantly. You go exactly where you want to go quickly, and it's just a tremendous service. And I think we really need to do it. It's the only answer in our location here. When I get to the stage where I can't drive, for me to get to a bus that's going to be at Byron's store, I have to walk a good quarter of a mile, well, more like half a mile through the rain. That's not very likely to happen as I get to the stage where I can't drive. But ride sharing comes right to your door, takes you right to, say, a doctor down here in Duncan. So I think it's an important element to our livability of our communities, and I'd like to suggest maybe it warrants going forward. Thank you.
Director Acton?
Yeah, I'd like to see something about agricultural land reserve, like land use on them, because our community, what the communities want to see happening on farms is not, it doesn't seem to jive with the same land use, and we have no control over what's happening on farms for, you know, when there's mining happening or land use that the community just doesn't feel like it's farm use. So I think there's something, it could be polished up a bit in that realm. So having some kind of suggestions from staff where they see the issues and the holes happening between bylaw and what's being done on these ALC lands would be helpful.
Director Nicholson, did I see your hand up again? No? So I'm going to play a little bit of gatekeeper here in the sense that I first vice president at AVICC, and there's an awful lot of work goes into the reading of resolutions and preparing resolutions to go through for consideration by the membership. And a couple of the topics that have been discussed have already been through AVICC and through to UBCM, and it is a considerable effort to have staff draft resolutions and put them forward they have to be considered by not only this committee but the board before they're sent through to AVICC. And so I would suggest that on matters such as ride hailing and the likes, or even ALC regulation, that they have been very well explored at a number of levels, and it takes almost a specific niche area of discussion for it to be considered for inclusion on in the resolutions book. So I would just bring your attention to the last one that we sent in was the around strong fiscal futures, and it was a white paper that was done a number of years ago that was rejected by the previous provincial government. And it sat and languished for a period of time until it became apparent that this document was something that could be embraced by the new government, and it was brought forward by AVICC to UBCM for a second look. And that was a very specific, very refined kind of role. Now, of the ones that we've discussed at this point, Director Nicholson has brought something up that I don't know that 5G has been discussed at at that level yet. Whether or not a federal matter, federal jurisdiction is something that would go through our regional and through to UBCM, when its probably most likely destination should be FCM. And I don't believe we've hit the deadline or been notified as the deadline for FCM resolutions yet. So I just, with that context, a fair bit of effort would have to go into staff working with the directors concerned to come up with resolutions, and the deadline is quick approaching. And I see Mr. Carruthers over there with something to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would suggest, I'm just looking at the calendar, your deadline for submissions is January 22nd. In order for staff to do the research necessary for the board to even consider if they want to move a resolution forward, we have the Christmas break coming. We're going to be very hard pressed to do the kind of research that would be necessary to support any of these proposed resolutions. What I'm going to suggest to the committee is that you have your strategic planning coming up, and that I would suggest that that would be the opportunity for the committee and ultimately the board to look at those strategic issues that are facing the regional district that you may want to have an advocacy strategy around that would help to guide us in terms of developing these resolutions, either for AVICC or UBCM. I just find it, as your administrator, really challenging at the 11th hour to come up with well thought out, well researched resolutions when we only have essentially a couple of weeks to do that work potentially.
Director Acton.
Well, that's a little challenging. Then you know, how do we get this sooner than next year? And pushing it to continuously push things like this to the board is not productive for electoral areas. They have a mayor and council, and they're talking about these things right now. So we should be able to focus on items that are electoral areas issues, because we don't have much else to protect us, and we don't even have the same legislation as they do.
Director Nicholson.
I happen to know a few people in the community who are well versed in this topic who would be delighted to provide any information staff need to help pull this together.
Director Taylor.
Thank you. I support what Director Atkin has been saying. Very much so. With ride sharing, it is an issue that isn't important to the municipalities that can have an effective bus route system. But the areas can't really do that effectively and provide good service. So I think it's incumbent on us to try to put forward these resolutions. As far as research on them, pretty straightforward. All we're saying is there is a ride-sharing service just been announced. Let's say that the CVRD supports that kind of service being made available within any of the receptive areas within the CVRD itself, and proceed and see if the other communities, regional districts have a similar point of view. I think that then provides strength to ride sharing when it goes to the provincial government, which has really dragged its feet on ride sharing, as we've seen in the stalls and the delays in getting it going in Vancouver and other places. And one of the big issues has been the pressure of the taxi lobby. And the interesting thing, when I was riding with the ride-sharing people, I asked, what about the taxi operators? They said, well, most of the taxi operators have become ride-sharing operators because they get more money and it's a better opportunity for them to work when they want to work. So I think that's the reason. We don't need to do tons of research. We need about one paragraph to say, let's go. Thank you.
Director Acton?
Well, maybe just a suggestion of, couldn't we have this conversation early January, more at a kind of casual level, where we could just discuss and come to some agreements on what are some of the issues that we might want to focus on and present to AVICC, just as a committee?
We can absolutely have a discussion at any time. I think part of what the call for resolutions that went out, and this was brought up, put on the agenda 2 weeks ago, I think unfortunately you weren't in attendance. The desire was that if there were any burning issues that is close to a fully flushed out resolution would come forward to this committee today so that it could go on the next board agenda and meet the deadlines. And I'm not seeing that that stage of development in a concept or idea of a resolution at this point. I see where Director Nicholson has got some assistance in the community that may be able to help, but I would suggest at this point the other two topics are likely not developed enough to meet a deadline, and would suggest that perhaps Director Nicholson can work with staff on that other issue. I'm not sure that the other two will, and I'm not trying to gauge whether or not they have merit, but I know that, for instance, on ride hailing, there's been a whole bunch of resolutions gone through, and by the time a resolution that comes through AVICC and goes to UBCM, all of those licenses are going to be issued, that are going to be issued. They're before the provincial government. So it's coming a little late to the game to put a ride-hailing resolution forward to AVICC. So I'm just suggesting that let's be prudent and effective with our time and put resolutions forward that are going to be impactful and help electoral areas. Director
Sorry,
Acton.
last comment then. Sure, fair enough. So as the chair of the committee then, could you commit to us getting together maybe in the spring? For some reason, I kind of feel like this happened last year too. The window is just too small. So if we were to we've planted the seed now in our mind, so we can keep it in mind and then come together as a committee early spring before the summer vacations and everything starts happening, and start really discussing what are we going to target, because not using AVICC, it's a great resource for us. We don't have a lot. So to give up that opportunity, I think is not very smart of us. So to be more proactive and prepared next year, let's put it on the calendar and start talking about it earlier so that we're ready for it.
Absolutely, and part of what's been successful in the past is when we've put items into our strategic priorities that they've been acted on. And there's plenty of time and research that's done to put forward good resolutions, and I think that's more than appropriate, and we can absolutely have those discussions, but 11th hour, it's a little difficult. I turn to Director Nicholson.
So just on this conversation, I guess I'm wondering, what is our schedule now for discussing strategic priorities? And I am specifically interested in the issue of roadside pathways and how I can get some roadside pathway work onto the parks work plan for next year. But we haven't discussed what our priorities are yet, and I'm just wondering when is that going to happen?
Mr. Carruthers, I'm looking over at you. I think that's your file.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have been looking at potential dates. I've actually referred some options to the board chair, looking potentially if we're able to secure the last week in January, or the second and third week of February. There's some available dates. I believe that we had wanted to have our governance workshop take place in the middle of middle of January 1st, before we embarked on strategic planning. So that's what we're targeting. And I believe there will be some canvassing going out to the board with respect to availability for some of those potential dates that we're looking at in January or February.
Director Nicholson.
Well, just to follow up, it seems to me that there are specific electoral area priorities that we need to discuss as an electoral area group. that doesn't require the whole board? Is that going to happen?
It's certainly my intention to make that happen. I just don't know where we were on scheduling. Mr. Carruthers, were we gonna do, the region and then the electoral areas or vice versa? So that was the intent, and that's what the board chair's idea is, okay. So, it looks like we will be having a full board, strategic priorities workshop, and then we will, then have an electoral areas workshop following. Director Nicholson.
So would it be possible for us to have a discussion about roadside pathways without waiting for all this? Because I would like to invest some of the gas tax funding in this important issue in my community. And I don't want to miss another year on the work plan because I've been trying to do this now for 5 years and it's getting extremely frustrating. And I know I've spoken with MOTI, and I know that we don't need to wait anymore. We've got the guidelines, we can go ahead. But I think it's a case of how are we going to roll this work out when I know that everyone around this table probably has their own priorities for that, and we need to have a conversation about it. And that's on that specific topic. I am very interested in moving forward now.
Thank you for that, Director Acton.
Well, yeah, and so to support other area directors, I don't think we should be waiting for board strategic planning. Like Director Nicholson pointed out, this is a completely different topic. The board is not going to be interested in roadside pathways. What do we make up here? 60% of the work that goes on here and taxes. So there's a lot of electoral area issues that I think we can't put on hold, and probably work plans are already set by the budget, so getting things rolling sooner than later would be preferable, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring us back to what we're actually talking about right now, which is AVICC resolutions. We can absolutely have a discussion, and there were attempts to have meetings to do electoral area priorities, and I have absolutely no qualms with us having those discussions. And if this committee decides that it wants to have some preliminary discussions in advance, we can talk to the board chair and see what his thoughts are about getting that done first. But for this item, I'd like to get some resolution as to AVICC resolutions. Are you wanting to move something forward, or do you want to put something forward for FCM, which is a little later in the year? Because it's definitely a federal issue.
Right, but I think it would be, okay, I can do that, but
Okay.
it would be useful to understand what other, it would be useful if staff would help work on this, because we need to understand what other munis and regional districts are thinking about this, and we need to understand. I mean, I think the basic issue is that there isn't anything that controls whether, there is no legislation that prohibits someone putting up the infrastructure right now, which is an issue.
Ms. Churl? No? Yes? Oh, I thought I saw you waving your hand there. No?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was simply going to state that in order for staff to be, directed in doing further research, we need to have an understanding of what the specific issue or problem statement is, and that's simply what I was requesting. Thank you.
So I'm going to suggest that when it comes to resolutions for outside bodies, that it does take a little bit of initiative on the individual directors to do a little bit of research, to go onto the websites of the various organizations like FCM and UBCM and AVICC to see if these are areas that have already been covered. And I think that for what we've got here, I don't see us having to put something forward, but I think FCM for the 5G is absolutely a good area that could be covered, and some of the other discussion. I think Director Acton would like to see a representative of the ALC come here and have some discussion with us about some of those issues. Alternate Director Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see 3 points here. I think it is important for our group, the electoral areas, to have that meeting as a group here to look at the key issues. And for example, I support Director Nicholson on the roadway pathways, the safety of them. we now have the Cowichan Valley Trail going through Saltaire, which is wonderful. The problem is, how do we get to it safely without getting hit by a transport truck on Old Chemainus Road to make that half-mile path? So I think that's a very key issue. I think, and the final point I would make is that on these, supposing one of us wanted to come forward with a package, it's pretty straightforward. They got the outline of what you need to do. And for example, on ride sharing, it's no big deal. Possibly I might take that on to draft it myself and put it forward, and then it can be looked at by the others. And if there's consideration to go ahead, and fine. And if it does go ahead, one of two things happens. It either is accepted, and maybe other municipal agencies go for it. If they don't, it gets thrown off the table, and it's history. Well, you made a try, you know, and maybe you win, maybe you don't. So I think we shouldn't get too wound up on having the best package going forward imaginable. The big thing is, let's get a package forward and see whether or not it floats, and if it does, we're home free. And we can get things like the pathways, getting the attention of other areas on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alternate Director Taylor. Seeing no other discussion on this item, move to the next. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No new,
Director Acton.
Before you close the meeting, I think that's coming next. So I'd like to, new year brings, for me personally, goals, and I think we should look at that. And I think in order to make sure that this is done timely, I would like to put forward a motion that our electoral areas starts their strategic planning as soon as possible, and perhaps a schedule be presented on our next electoral area services meeting.
Do we have a seconder for that?
Second that.
We have a motion duly moved and seconded. Do you have it in writing? You'll help Ms. Legault with what the intent of that is. Everybody is clear on what's being moved and seconded? Call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. Ms. Legault, I think we're on to
question period.
question period. Is there any questions from members of the gallery today for the chair? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was done in record time.
Not even close.
Would it be possible for, as part of the Area E APC's OCP planning, several of our members are very well versed in the 5G, and would it be possible for Director Nicholson to draw upon them to give some feedback to the board?
The issue's done with. I think she's talked about bringing something forward for FCM, and whatever Director Nicholson wants to do in consultation with, she can bring that forward to staff in the drafting of a resolution.
Thank you. And to speak to ride sharing, I think it's a good thing for our valley if we think about it. But would it be possible from somebody that has worked in the emergency services field and as a professional driver in more than one of my careers, that the board consider, if you do adopt a ride sharing, that the board supports the provincial's governments, or Vancouver, I think it is actually, request that the drivers have their Class 4 driver's license. I think they are driving for hire, that they should, for pay, that they should have that same level of training. It's only in their best interest and those of their fares.
Fair enough, and I don't believe the provincial government has sought to consult the local governments on the licensing requirements, but we could certainly take that into consideration.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, would it be out of order if I wished all the directors and staff the very best of the holidays, and I hope you get a well-deserved rest? Thank you.
I think you just did. Thank you. Any other questions for the chair? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, when will we have a soil deposit bylaw report?
I have no idea. I'll get back to you at the next meeting. It's not on today's agenda, and I don't know when it's next scheduled to happen.
Mr. Chair, wasn't Elkington Forest supposed to build a fire hall as part of their amenity to having that all rezoned? And when it was changed over to Malahat, we don't hear anything of our amenities that we're supposed to get. And that fire hall, from what I understand, was supposed to be built in cooperation with Malahat Fire District. I believe a truck was going to go from there, and that was going to cover all the Gulfstream Heights and Elkington.
Well, I haven't heard any of those details. I know that amenities have been brought forward in not just the previous board, but before that, and I think a question could be directed offline to our public safety department and our land use services about whether or not those amenities were promised and never delivered. I know that there's no fire hall down there at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like we've just lost out on all our amenities, or they're stalled right now. Mr. Chair, this was news to me that you are testing wells too for part of your development permits.
I don't believe that's the case. I believe that it's a requirement of subdivision. We don't test the wells.
Right, so the subdivision tests them, but from what I understand, most of them are just tests for pathogens and bacteria. And in cases where there's known metals to be in the area, or maybe high levels of nitrogen, could we not include that in that the wells be tested for those things too?
I don't believe that's our jurisdiction in Silent Hills.
Well, I just heard from Mr. Munn that as part of your checking of a development service, we've had VHA up at on Gulfstream Heights, and they did check that out. But on a normal development permit, I think most people just check for pathogens and bacteria.
So are you asking for enhancements to the subdivision servicing bylaw that we currently have in place?
Yes.
I would suggest that that be brought forward to your area director and can be discussed with staff at a future date. But I don't believe the level of testing is a requirement that you're suggesting is a requirement of ours under our subdivision servicing bylaw currently.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Evans, and Merry Christmas to you as well. Is there anyone else have any questions for the board chair? Ms. Legault, the next item would be
Adjournment.
motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Let's go and spend some time with our families. Merry Christmas, everyone.